Never mind. So please sign and your name and your email address, and there is just one piece of paper for both students and externals. So, okay. So we can start. So I'm glad to see you on this evening. So the lecture has been rescheduled because of events independent of our goodwill. But so it has not been cancelled. So tonight we're gonna discuss of health, illness, what are they, how we define what is health and what is illness, and how we make the difference between what is normal from the medical viewpoint and what is pathological. So just let's try to, with some definitions, some quotes. The first one is by a philosopher. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Delaware, Christopher Bourse. And he says that health is the absence of disease, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. And also tells us that indeed it's easier to define what is health by saying what is not. If you think about it, we can define positively, affirmatively, what is a disease. We can define what is recovering, but what is health is maybe is when do you feel well? Well, when I'm not sick. It's one of the most immediate things that can come to our mind. There is another definition similar by a 19th century French physician, René Leriche, who said that health is life lived in the silence of the organs, which is kind of more poetic, but basically says the same thing. The second definition, which is a kind of sounds more authoritative than the first one, because it's from an international organization, the World Health Organization, founded in the aftermath of World War II in 1948, which kind of seems to to dismiss the first one, because this definition says health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, which basically add another dimension. So health is not just about the physical well-being or the mental well-being, but it is also the social aspects is involved in how we define, how we perceive health. And the last definition is, the last quote is by Descartes, Cartesius, French philosopher of 17th century, who said the conservation of health is without doubt the primary good and the foundation of all other good of this life. which kind of recalls what we were talking about briefly last Tuesday, that nowadays we tend to consider health as one of the highest values of our life. But if you want to take a look at the etymology of the word health and illness, actually it's quite interesting, because health comes from the verb to heal, which makes to make whole, to make complete. Basically, being in good health means being complete. And also, it means also to make a salutation. It comes from the German Heil. To make a salutation, basically to wish someone prosperity and good health, actually. The word illness comes from the adjective ill, which means evil, offensive to me, for example. What is illness is something that damages myself, for example. And the word disease comes from the French aise, which means comfort, so absence of comfort, discomfort, disease. But let's take a look at an historical perspective, because the concepts of health and illness can be and have been analyzed and studied by philosophy, history, medicine, of course, anthropology, sociology. And let's try to go through all these different approaches tonight, and to have a broader idea of what is health and illness than a physician. So let's start with history and with primitive culture. So among primitive cultures, the concept of and the idea of health and illness are really strictly linked with religion. Being sick, getting a disease means having you did something that offended the gods. You commit a moral mistake. And that is why, the reason why in primitive culture the figure, there is not a figure like a physician or a healer, which is not, which is without a sacred religious connotation. Here is an image of a medicine man, of the healer of Native Americans, which is a figure in between the physician and the priest, or the which summon the spirits and prepare potions in order to deliver the sick person from his disease. But it's both, if you want, a medical and a religious intervention. And think also about the dietary requirement of religion. The interdiction of eating, for example, pork in I don't know, the Muslim religion or the Jewish religion, is linked to a concept of purity, which is both physical health but also spiritual health. This same mix between secular and sacred we find in ancient Greek and ancient Rome, because if you take a look at the pantheon of ancient Greece, we have a god of medicine, Asclepius, who was one of the sons of the god Apollon, and Yzma, which was one of the daughters of Asclepius, the goddess of purity, the goddess of health. Yzma is the same racine of the word hygiene. But Greece gave us not just Asclepius and Yzma, but also Hippocrates, whose over-influential conception of health and illness has nothing to do with religion, is purely secular. I don't know if you are familiar with the theory of the four humors. Have you ever heard about that?
I've heard.
Yeah, please, can you maybe...
Very strange theory.
The strange theory, yeah.
Strange theory.
But, yeah, go ahead.
That's all.
Yeah. So, according to Hippocrates and to the Hippocratic medicine, there are four major humors that form the human body and circulate in the human body. There is blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. These four, this tetralogy, these four elements correspond to the natural elements, so fire, air, earth, and water, and to four different weather conditions, atmospherical condition, wet, cold, dry, and hot. Eventually there is a correspondence with the four seasons and so on and so forth. And according to Hippocrates, when someone is sick, is because of an imbalance between these four humors. And in order to restore health, is sufficient to restore the balance, to reestablish the balance, the equilibrium between these four elements. And how we can achieve this goal? Well, for example, through diet, rest, or bloodletting, or exercise, and so on. But no god, no deity, no spirit is involved in this economy of health and sickness. The Hippocratic theory was inherited by the Romans. If you read the books written by Galen, who was let's say the equivalent of Hippocrates for the Romans, one of the father, or considered one of the father of the medicine, you find more or less the same ideas. As well in the Roman pantheon, you find gods of medicine. And let's move to the Middle Age. Yeah, the Middle Age actually inherited the concepts and knowledge, medical knowledge of the ancient Greece and ancient Rome, also the Arabic medicine, not just because Arabs were the translators of most of the ancient texts of the antiquity arrived to the Middle Ages thanks to Arabic translators, but also physicians like Yzma or Avicenna or Averroes were studied and were influential during the Middle Age. We are talking about, let's say, not popular medicine, but learned medicine. The people who during the Middle Ages studied the medicine in the university, studied Galen, Hippocrates, the masters of the Arabic medicine, and so on. This kind of knowledge was not, let's say, accessible to the little people. But for what is one of the most powerful influence in the medieval conception of health and illness, we need to think about the Judeo-Christian culture and the influence of the concept of health and disease during the Middle Age was shaped by the Christian religion. And what does the Christian religion says about the body? Is something seen as positive, something that a good Christian is supposed to enjoy and to, or is the seat of the sin? The second, yeah, definitely. Well, we are supposed to suffer during this life. To our body is made of flesh. Its destiny is to grow old and eventually decompose, and eventually come back to life during the Judgment Day. But it's the spiritual life, what is really important for the Christian religion. And according to the Christian religion, the mortification of the body is something that it's a way to achieve, to purify the spirit. And the Church during the Middle Ages had a kind of ambivalent relationship with both medicine and diseases, because diseases could be understood as a punishment from God, but also as a proof. God can send you a very painful disease to prove your capacity of bearing this kind of burden. You need to recall that the Christ suffered when he was on earth, and a Christian who is pure in spirit and is capable of suffering is kind of the image of Christ. Think about the representation of the saints. Most of them are martyrs, so they died in great suffering, but some saints are represented. The iconography shows saints carrying diseases. There is a saint, Saint Roch, R-O-C-H, which is represented with a terrible injured in one leg, and according to the sacred history, a dog licked his wound and he was cured. And Saint Roch is the patron saint of a city in the south of France called Montpellier, who is the city of one of the most ancient medical school of Europe. But to come back at this kind of ambivalence of the Church towards disease, maybe one of the most typical embodiment is the history of leprosy. Do you know what the leprosy is? Because it's still around, not in Europe, but for example in Africa, in some it's still very much around. Do you know what kind of disease leprosy is?
Yes. Kind of infection with this disease.
Yes, it affects your whole body and skin specifically, and you start to decay in a literal sense.
Yeah.
Parts of you just decay, and you are like a living corpse.
Yeah, let's say yes. It's a disease which is nowadays uncurable. It's a very slow disease, which means that it takes literally decades before dying. And one of the most characteristic symptoms is the consumption of hands and feet, of the extremities. And the origin of this disease is India, and from India it came to the Middle East. And when the Crusaders started, the Christian knights who went fighting in the Holy Land, when they survived, it was not infrequent that they came back carrying this condition. And what was the policy in the Middle Age towards people who had this disease? Well, in the first place, they were cast out from city, and they were forced to live in a village where only they were allowed to live. They were called leprosarium, or leprosaria in Latin plural. So we could say it is kind of a punishment. Not really, because so you can see maybe in this image here there's a bishop who is she's blessing this four men with the signs, the disfigurement of the leprosy, because if people who get this disease were forced to live outside the civil society, the church obliged the civil power to maintain this community of sick people. The city council, for example, or the prince or the lord of a town was forced to send money, food and goods that this community of people with leprosy could need. And if the civil authority failed, say no, I don't want to spend money for those people, well, the church could react and eventually excommunicate. And this is because the people carrying this disease were, at the eye of the church, the image of the Christ suffering, and because this disease basically came to Europe because of the people who fought during the Crusades, well, it was a kind of sacred disease that the church and the church felt the obligation of display charity toward these people. Yes?
Wasn't leprosy also perceived as a punishment from God for sins?
Yes, and that is because they were these people were cast out from the civil society, were excluded, even if so technically when there was a person who was in suspect to get this disease, there was a trial with a priest, a member of the civic authority, and someone who already got this disease, because they want to be sure that it was really leper. Then, if the person was recognized as in effect attained by this disease, there was a funeral. The person were declared dead to the eye of the communities. If he had children, the children inherited the wealth of these people, and these living dead were cast out from the community. So you can see the dimension of the punishment, but at the same time you see the church would not say, well, cast them out and let them die of their and left them to their destiny. Yes?
I'm not talking individual punishment, but wasn't it perceived as a punishment for society for becoming sinful? So, for example, we as a community, as a society, commit crimes, and therefore we have some diseases, you know, like this one.
Well, this specific disease came from, as I said, arrived in Europe from the people who fought in the Holy Land. So it was not like the Black Death, for example, who was perceived as a punishment from God. And indeed, there were processions, was absolutely common, in order to pray the Lord to stop this punishment and to try to purify the community from the sins that were considered at the origin of these calamities. Yes?
So what about dead bodies? They will burn on just digging the ground, or what do they do with?
Well, according to the church, you shall not burn a body, but you shall bury it in the ground, because if you burn the body, how can you resurrect during the Judgment Day? So, But let's say that the common sense frequently were more, let's say, effective, because even if the concept of contagion were acknowledged by medicine only in the late 18th, early 19th century, people realized, even centuries before, that if you burn, that the fire purifies, and if a body is decomposed and ruined by a disease, it's safer just to burn it. And when the judgment day will come, God will find a way to resurrect even the ashes. But this ambiguity the Church displayed also toward medicine, because technically, if you are a doctor and you try to heal a disease that comes from God, you interfere with the action of God, and this is not good. But this was a very radical position, but it was endorsed by a consistent part of the Church. On the other hand, one of the commitments of a good Christian of the Church is charity. So the Church shall display charitable attitudes and give help to those who are the more fragile and necessitous member of the society. The very first hospitals were created and run by the Church. And for hospital, till let's say the second half of the 19th century, you need to think not at a place where people are cured, but but just a place where people are hosts. They just stay there. It's like a hotel. The root of the word is the same, hospitality, and. It's just okay. They are fragile. They are in danger. They are also in danger. They are also a danger for the community. So let's keep all these people in one place, safe, and in that way, we help. We display charity toward these people. Yes.
So this for me is look more not like hospital, more like hospice.
Yeah, the root of the word is exactly the same. Now we make a difference between a hospice, for example, for senior citizens who are incapable of taking care of themselves, and a hospital. Hospital is when you get sick, get cured, and get off. It's very rare. For centuries, people went to the hospital when they had nowhere else to go, and not just sick people. Poor people and sick people were, and old people were frequently in the same place called hospital. And and just in later in history, these different words started meaning different things. And yes, let's come to the early modern era, when some steps toward the secular conception, secular idea of what is medicine, what is illness, and what is health started coming around. Well, this is the I don't know if you ever taken classes of history of philosophy. Do you know some of these, one or two or three of these men?
One of the greatest philosophers.
Yeah, and they are considered, or at least these two, as father of the empiricism. So Descartes, beside the quote we mentioned before, well, is well known for the importance that the reason has in his philosophy. and for having formulated a great influential theory about the distinction between the mind and the body. John Locke is considered English philosopher. He considered one of the fathers of the empiricism, a philosophy that stressed the importance of observation and experience as a proof of reality, of facts, and as an access to knowledge. And Isaac Newton, other English philosopher and physicist, is well known for his theory about the laws of universal gravitation. So the universe is just a big mechanism that can, and the movement of the planets can be explained by a few simple rules. And if we take a look at some of the most influential physicians of the time, we can find some commonalities in their work. For example, William Harvey, he was the first to I wouldn't say discover, but to demonstrate that the blood circulates. The circulation of the blood, who was something that was in contradiction with one of the greatest authority of not just antiquity but Middle Age and early modern era, Aristotle. Harvey said that the blood circulates, and the heart is like a pump. So a kind of mechanicistic conception of the body, which is like a mechanism which is activated and kept alive by a pump that push the blood all over inside the body. And Herman Boerhaave, which was a Dutch physician and biologist, he is the father of a conception which is called iatromechanicism. Basically, to put it simple, is the idea that the body is like a machine, and it works like a complex and perfect mechanism. And you could say, but and God in all this conception just disappeared. Well, no, God is just considered like an architect, like a clockmaker, who has made this perfect mechanism that started the mechanism, but then he does not intervene. The turn toward the medicine as a science came, as we saw during the first class, during the modern era. We mentioned briefly Louis Pasteur, who was a French chemist and considered the father of modern bacteriology and biochemistry. It also was worth it to recall François Xavier Bichat, who was a French physician, and he is considered one of the founder of the anatomopathology, which means the connection between a disease and some visible wounds in the tissues. So basically, the localization, the fact that a disease leaves, you can spot the sign of a disease by the examination of the tissues of the body. So no spiritual or supernatural entities involved, and observation and experience. What are the conceptions of health and illness in the 21st century? Well, 21st century is considered, we're gonna discuss this in great detail in the next weeks, but as the time of epidemiological transition, which means there are less and less acute diseases, like for example, it could be, I don't know, the smallpox or even influenza, but more chronic diseases, because the medicine now is capable of let's say saving life, preserve from death people even if they have serious condition, to delay the death, but someone with a chronic disease, even if it's stabilized, it's hard to say if it's if he or she is in health or is sick. But let's try, beside the historical aspect, to understand what are health and illness, and we can list, you can count 3 explanatory models. So we can say that illness, for example, and health are biological facts. It's something that I can describe using the knowledge from medicine, from chemistry, from biology, so are just pure biological facts. Or we can say that are both physical and psychological condition. If I have, I don't know, fever, yes, I can describe it with the knowledge and the paradigm of medicine, but also I feel bad in my mind. I'm not happy. There are also conditions called psychosomatic diseases that are considered in the first place originated by psychological distress. There are psychological conditions that have no physical signs, but a person is considered as sick. Or third model, we can take into account, we can say that health and disease are social and cultural status. That's the society in which where we live and the culture that we share shape the concepts, the way we perceive and define health and illness. So these 3 models are not mutually exclusive, which means it's not this or this or this. It's well, you can find people who claims that I don't know, a disease is just a biological fact and basta. But it's more reasonable and it's more accurate to consider that these 3 models are complementary and not exclusive. And let's focus on the last one. What is a disease from a social and cultural viewpoint? So let's start with understanding what are we talking about when we talk about society and culture. So a society is a community or group or people having common institutions, tradition, shared rules and values. A culture is a system of learned and shared codes or standards of perceiving, interpreting and interacting with others and the environment. So basically considering how that these are the environment where we are born and we live, it kind of makes sense to think that the society where we live, the culture that we share, the values that we have an influence, have an impact on what we call health and illness, and what and the way the a person considered as health or sick is perceived by the society and interact with other members of the society. And one of the most influential sociologists who worked on the social perception of health and business was this man, Talcott Parsons, author of The Social System, book published in 1951, who called the expression of the sick role. So for him, yes, of course, a disease is a medical condition, but when someone is sick, it means that he starts having a very precise social role. He considers sickness as a social disruption, as a social as a social deviance, because when a person is sick, well, normally in the first place is considered that he is not his fault. If someone is sick, it's not his fault. And it is exempted from some duties that a person normally should fulfill if in good health. For example, this kid is not going to school today because apparently he has a fever and he's not feeling well at all. But a person who is sick is a person that also has a moral obligation. He have to do his best to recover, and so he is supposed to, he or his family, to seek for medical help, to believe to what the physicians say, and to make sure that this kid is gonna take all the medicine that the doctor says him to take. Because when someone is sick, is not a productive member of the society. So the society is going to, in the first place, punish him, because someone who is sick is kind of isolated from the rest of the society, or put in relative isolation. This kid is not gonna see his friends until he is going well, and the society pushed to seek for medical attention, and the physician is considered like a social, having a social role, is the one who restores the balance, who makes this social disruption heal, to make this social transgression come back to normal. So this is in really simple way what the sick role is from the view according to Parsons. As you can say, well, it kind of makes sense, and it tells us that we cannot make this kind of analysis if we have at our disposal just the tools of hard science. We can go ahead, continue thinking about what is the attitude of society toward a person who is sick. We can add someone which is called stigmatization, because even if Parsons said that in general, when you are ill, the society says it's not your fault. What happens in reality? Well, the mom of this kid could have been very well said, oh, you silly, it's your fault because you played all the afternoon with your friends without wearing just a t-shirt. So he's kind of, he can kind of put a kind of stigmatization on his poor child. But also, when, for example, when you are ill, where you might feel guilty because you know that your mom and your dad are in pain because you're causing you're making worried your family and friends. Or people around you display a kind of look at you as you were a pitiful human being, and you don't want this. So there is a stigmatization towards a person who are toward illness, and in some cases it attains the paroxysm. For example, if you take the example of the United States and the poorest members of the society are considered very frequently as responsible of their poor health. They cannot afford insurance, so frequently they have conditions that technically are curable, but they materially cannot afford the cure. For example, if you take a look at the incidence of diabetes in the United States, you see that the most of the people who had this condition are African Americans or people living below the soil of poverty. Diabetes is linked not just to genetic predisposition, but also to what you eat. And if you're poor, you can't afford, you can more easily afford sugary drink and fast food, which are food that enable this kind of condition. And if you are poor, you can afford insulin, because insulin costs thousands of dollars there. But people, there is a shared mentality in this society, in the American society, that says, well, they are in this situation because they are lazy, because they do not work hard enough, because if they worked hard enough, they could afford insurance. And it's a vicious circle. But we have said that our culture tends to consider health as one of the most important values. But it is difficult to give a positive definition, positive in the sense of affirmative, to say health is this, this and this. And it is easier to say health is the absence of disease. But now in our culture we tend to have some positive words defining health. For example, wellness. What is wellness to you? Or to you, when you heard the word wellness in the mainstream, for example, commercials or magazines and so on, what is wellness?
Healthy diet.
Sorry?
Healthy diet.
Yeah.
Harmony in your body.
Yeah. So it's in this case, it's an invitation to either go beyond the state of health, or at least be mindful, be completely aware of the fact that you are feeling good. This young woman on the seaside, she's I don't know, meditating, or and we can presume that the message of this picture is this person is doing something good for herself, but she is also perfectly aware of her well-being. And our culture is pushing us to go beyond the health, to achieve a status which is even more appealing. Fitness. Yeah. People do not born this way. You need to exercise to achieve this status, which is considered displayed as more desirable than basic health. Let's continue to discuss about society, but let's move the objective from the individual to the group, because we can consider that there are some conditions that are developed because of social factor, because of the environment where a person lives. And this is a kind of concept that have been developed in the early 19th century. In correspondence with some major social and environmental changes, the Industrial Revolution, the phenomenon of urbanization, the surge, the appearance of the proletariat. During the 19th century, and 80th in England, but mostly during the 19th century, as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, people started working in environments that were small, unhealthy, where they worked in extremely poor conditions, and they lived in the outskirts of cities, in very small houses, in hygienic and in hygienic conditions that were extremely precarious, and they started becoming an object of social inquiry, which means intellectual or people from the middle upper class started thinking about this new phenomenon and asking questions about are these people, who are these people who in the space of a few years have coming from the countryside and established, I don't know, in the outskirts of Manchester, in disgusting houses and so on and so on. Who are these people? What do they do? Are they dangerous? And so on and so forth. So you have in the first half of the 19th century all a series of social observators, of social investigators who want to, who went to see the condition of work and life of the proletariat. Sometimes these kind of inquiries were financed by the government. It's the case of this book written by this man who was a physician and who spends years traveling around France and visiting the cities and towns where the textile industry were developing. And he observed the conditions of living, of working, and also of behaving. The title of his study is translated is the study of the physical and moral condition of the wool, silk, and the cotton, wool, and silk workers. But you have other examples. One of the most famous is this: the condition of the working class in England, written by Friedrich Engels. Do you know what Friedrich Engels did for a living?
Sure.
He lived all his life as a capitalist. He lived all his life as a capitalist. Yeah, he was the son. Yeah, he was the son of a very wealthy industrial. His father owned factories, of textile factories in the north of England. And even if it wasn't against his values as in principle, he inherited the wealth and the work of his father and continued working and acting as a capitalist, if you want, even if it was completely against his belief. And thanks of the money he could make, he could maintain the family of Karl Marx and allow Karl Marx to write his to do his work. But this book is one of the first and the most shocking reportage, we would say today, of the conditions of the workers of the factory, like the factory of his father. And always about the factory in North England. There is the reportage written by Alexis de Tocqueville. Do you know who he was? Have you never heard of a book called The Democracy in America?
Yes, philosophy and political thinkers.
Yeah, he was
French.
He was French. He was an aristocrat, Alexis de Tocqueville. He was he was trained as a judge and then became eventually a politician and a philosopher. And he traveled in England and in Ireland, and in the journal he published, he delivers the description of Manchester at the beginning of the 19th century, saying, watching the tremendous aspects of the workers of the factory of Manchester, who he said, it is difficult to find one man or one woman who has a body who is whole, he is in health, because he said, well, you look at the people who works in this place, they have an hunchback, the finger missing, they are coughing, they are sick. So this is not a kind of a virus, a kind of bacteria. This is a fault of the environment of which these people live and work. And this was the beginning of not just all tons of inquiry and data collected, which are kind of a treasure for historians, because if you wanna work on this period and on this topic, you have a lot of information that you can use. It's also, you make discoveries that kind of let you, are really astonishing. For example, inquiries on the city of Paris show that the time that the lifespan, the life expectancy of people living in Paris changed depending on the district of the people. And the gap was up to 20 years. Means that someone living in a fancy district had a life expectancy of 60 years, and someone living in a poor district just 40. Or the fact that during the medical examination before enrolling the army, a lot of people of coming from poor families were just exonerated because they weren't tall enough. And this was also the beginning of a movement called the movement of the hygienism. This is Gallicism, because the original word comes from French. It's called Eugénisme. Basically, it was a movement endorsed, started by physicians, politicians, administrators, and also philanthropists that aware of the fact that the environment, the social environment, the urban environment, and the working environment has an impact on the on the health of the people, started campaigning for good health practices, For example, going to the public bath in order to prevent diseases, but also started big operation of renewal, of requalification of districts that were in really poor condition, and in order to make the urban environment more healthy and to prevent this kind of effect on the more fragile population. This kind of inquiry eventually continued during all the century, and there are seizable evidence of the impact of this kind of intervention on the life expectancies and the quality of life and health of the population. And let's say, for now we have talked about health and illness, but more technical words that can be used to describe these conditions are normal and pathological. So normal comes from the Latin norma, which means square. It means the tool of the carpenter used to make a measurement, and also from the Greek nomos, which means law. And well, pathological. Sorry, I forgot the slide. The pathological comes from the Greek pathos, which means pain. Pathology is something that causes pain. The same root of the word also patient, both in the sense of someone who is at the hospital and is a patient of a doctor because he's suffering, and also someone who is a patient as a character, as a disposition. But we can define what is normal either from the medical viewpoint and from a social viewpoint. So the medical norm can be described as the biological characteristics of an average individual. Biological characteristic means characteristics you can measure, and characteristics that are not supposed to change. Yes?
Are you talking about a historical definition of medical normality, or are you giving this current definition? Because there's other way to define medical normality which can distance itself from this average individual.
For example, this is a kind of simplification. What are you thinking about?
You could talk, for example, functionality.
Yeah.
You could talk in teleological terms. For example, say that you have a certain part of your body, say your limbs or your mouth, and if it operates normally in the sense that it fulfills its function, then it's a normal state. So you can escape this average individual.
Yeah, this what you just mentioned is the definition of the medical normal that were defined by Claude Bernard, who was a French physician, and is a kind of medical normal equal physiological normal. And this was a kind of definition that has been both successful and contested, because this kind of definition makes a little different to make the distinction between what you define as a physiological normal and correctly functioning and what you define as ideally functioning and ideally normal, because this kind of definition is technically made without a statistical inquiry, because if you want to define the medical normal from a statistical viewpoint, you need to collect data, to organize data, to process data, and you obtain something that is more the physiological normal. But let's stay to this very simplified definition, just to make to understand what the difference between the medical normal, defined as a collection of biological conditions, biological elements and quantitative elements, measurable elements, and the social normal, because what is normal, we should define normal by a society, within a society, is the collection of formal and informal rules within a community. Give me an example of a formal rule in the society.
Do not be late to an SAS class for more than 5 minutes, or you'll be thrown out of the room.
If I were, yeah, but SAS is not the whole society. Think bigger, think more general. Yeah.
Excuse me, you mean laws as a formal rule?
Yeah, a law is a classical example, a formal rule within a community. If you steal something, you go to jail, and this is because the penal code says at one article that this is it. Tell me an example of an informal rule.
Moral principles.
For example.
Just give a seat for a pregnant woman or no.
For example. This is a very good example of informal rule. There is no article on the civil code that says you shall allow an elderly person or a pregnant woman to sit on a bus, but it's a rule of living together in good harmony, to behave that way. But this rule, both formal and informal, do they remain the same as the characteristics or the law of the human biology or the human physiology? Or they change?
Both change, actually.
All change, yeah. Indeed, but with different pace, let's say, at different speed. But let's say at least that these are supposed to be more stable than the other, because if humanity evolved, society evolved a little bit faster. But the concept of average, an average man, an average person, actually has been theorized by this man who was a Belgian meteorologist, yeah, statistician, to put it. Do you know the statistic as a discipline? Where does it come from? What was the very first applications of statistics?
No idea.
So count the population.
Yeah, and to count the population for what?
For economic reasons, some economic goal.
Yeah, taxes, for example.
Yes, taxes basically.
And also for the army. It started basically, were not scientists or mathematicians who started collecting data and organizing and processing data, were administrators. In the 18th century, especially it started in Germany, a kind of a philosophy called the cameralism, which means basically science of administration. The idea was the power of a state is measurable by the number of the population and the number of soldiers. Yes?
I think it started long before Europe. I mean, if you read Bible, for example, counting population is condemned in Bible, so therefore you could say that this idea to count population was present in
yeah, let's say that it was applied systematically and was theorized also. in the 18th century. And basically administrators started counting the population for economic reasons, for taxes, for being sure of how many soldiers were available, and eventually make projections. But in the 19th century, this kind of proceeding of collecting, organizing, and analyzing data were expanded not just to the population, but to basically everything, from the meteorological conditions to the people. And for people it means the human body and the human behavior. So this man who wrote this treatise on man and the elements of his faculties basically collected hundreds and hundreds of data by measuring persons, both observing the physical characteristics and the behavioral characteristics, and came up with a statistical definition of what was the average man. So I collect all this data, I see what are the characteristics that are between two extremes, and I came with something like that. I see this is above average, this is beyond average, I see this is the middle, and the average to corresponded to in this treatise to what is good health, because if this is the configuration, the most common in nature, it must be for one reason. So the average man was considered like the definition of average, like something not just a mathematic term, but also with a positive connotation. And this is kind of common sense. Have you ever heard the say that the right lies in the middle? This is kind of comes from Aristotle, the Ethics for Nicomachus. It's a kind of common knowledge, but it from the statistical viewpoint kind of made sense. But Quetelet, he measured not just the physical characteristic, but also monitored the behavior, the moral, if you want, characteristics. And it came up that it was possible to define average characteristics also for the way people behaved. But is behavior the same thing that, for example, the height of the weight of a person? What happens if we say that the physical characteristics are in a certain way, there is an analogy, a correspondence between the physical and the moral characteristics. We can measure both, we can collect the same way, we can collect data of on both and draw conclusions about what is the average, I don't know, age for marriages, or the average number of times people go to church.
And you might get something like phrenology, right?
Bingo!
Yes.
Phrenology. What is phrenology? What was?
Phrenology is this idea that you can look at someone's, measure a person's skull, for example,
Yeah.
areas,
With something like this.
Something about his intellectual capability.
Yeah.
This is a totally crazy idea.
Yeah, this is what now we consider a pseudoscience, not real science, but at the time was considered solid gold. And think about it, you can measure things, you can, you have numbers. you recall trusting numbers the last time. You can physically use this kind of torture device and measure the skull of a person, and eventually draw a map like this, that says, oh yes, the shape of your skull is this way, so it means that you are versed in mathematics, for example, or arts, or yes.
But if you look at the victims of Zika virus, you know what is this? Zika virus.
Yeah.
Skull very small. Very small.
I think
After these diseases.
Zika virus influences.
Well, yeah, I know that it's carried by mosquitoes, and but I admit I've never seen someone who contracted this disease. And what happens? The skull reducts.
When we are measuring the skulls, it makes sense. This measure.
Do you think there could have been Platonic influence to this? Because in the Republic, for example, there was this idea that you have to look at a person from a very young age and say something about his
What it was like when he was in the hyperuranium.
Yeah, basically there was this idea that you can somehow look at the person, at his physical and other characteristics.
Yeah, well, I think...
and then say, well, you're in a better position to do this job rather than some other type.
Yeah, well, I would say that even nowadays we keep having impression from people. If you see someone who has a face that you don't like very much, you see, this looks like a criminal, for example. It looks like the people I do not want to approach because it could hurt me or something like that. I mean, it's quite difficult to draw a line to say, or it is possible, but I think you have to be very careful to make the distinction between what is a good or bad impression, what is something that you claim being a science, which means I can spot just looking in the eyes, looking to you in the eyes, if you're gonna be a good, I don't know, physicist or sculptor or criminal, for example, and making the external appearance as the first indicator of other kind of quality. So tell me if this could not be a definition of racism, for example. Which, by the way, till in the origins lies in this kind of theories. Why, for example, people originally from Africa were considered closer to primates and less evolved than the white men. Well, people at the time could make measurement and write a scientific treatise drawing this kind of conclusions. Yes?
A bit of questions about phrenology. I know the story about a gentleman who just, okay, just distract here front part of brain, just Aaron stick. He threw his picks through his head.
This is classical.
Yeah, just technically his skull didn't have a real destruction. He stayed the same that he was before, but his mind was like just caveman.
Yeah.
So what could phrenologists say about this story? Just if his skull didn't have really much differences, but his behaving didn't look. His behavior was not like he should be.
But are you talking about lobotomy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is the brain also is involved in this kind of operation.
But just if phrenologists they study know
So
all about
so do not mix what phrenology was, which was the assumption that according to the form of your skull you have some qualities or characteristics or stuff, with the fact that we have lobes in our brain with area they are for example, we have an area of our brain which is the seat of memory, which is the seat of visual perception or tactile perception. So this is neurology. This involves the central nervous system, not the external shape of the skull. The brain is not involved in, is not involved as is described by modern neurology.
So phrenologists make the conclusion most of gynecology. Okay, just maybe my mom has the same ears, the same how can I say, the same form of head as me.
Yeah.
Me. So this is why you can say that I have the same.
Yeah, there is what we call they didn't call at the time, but there is a kind of genetic link, genetic predisposition. For example, it becomes more clear maybe with this slide. Cesare Lombroso, who was Italian.
Right?
Sorry?
Criminals.
Yeah, it's the father of the criminal anthropometry. So the word anthropometry. Let's split this word. Anthropos, which means man, and measurement of the man. So he wrote the book, or the books, The Criminal Man and the Criminal Woman. And what was Lombroso's grand idea?
That you can look.
No, you don't look, you measure.
Yeah, you measure it basically, but there are some typical faces that are more prone to certain types of crime.
Yeah, for example, if your eyes are too close, if you have a kind of hawk-like nose, if your forehead is too high or too small. Brief. If you have fleshy lips, for example, you have all the characteristics of being a natural-born criminal. Yes.
I wonder if what he was really measuring were characteristics of a social class, of an economic or social group, and maybe some groups, because of oppression, because of some economic factors, they tend to have certain characteristics. These physical characteristics are not correlated with crime just because they are per se criminal, but because they tend to happen more in groups which are under certain social groups.
Yes, this is, well, when you start making the superposition between physical and moral characteristics, it's kind of a slippery slope. Who defines what are the good moral values? The ruling class. Which is the ruling class? I don't know, the Victorian bourgeoisie in 19th century England, the middle class in in French during the Third Republic. So basically it's a social normalization, the process that can be validated by this kind of rationale. It was not a kind of coincidence that, for example, in France there were at the time enforced policies that said if you are caught 3 times by the police, even for petty crimes, it means that you are a natural born criminal, that nobody can, that no prison, no sentence can correct your behavior. You're gonna restart again once you are purged your sentence. So we send you in Guyana, outside the society, because we know that it's in your nature to continue being a criminal, or to continue being a prostitute. The equivalent of the criminal man, the criminal woman, is the prostitute. And who is a criminal man and who is a criminal woman? Well, are individuals that are less evolved than the average man, and they are less intelligent, and they can master the most basic instincts like lust, like violence, and so on. Yes.
There is also a famous book titled "Woman, Criminal and Prostitute," but I'm not sure if it's his book or not.
Well, his study on women is called the criminal woman, and the conclusion is the equivalent of the criminal man is basically the prostitute. But let's just say a few words about, this is not a police photo, even if it looks like he was not a criminal, natural born criminal. No, he was the man who actually wrote the book called The Normal and Pathological. He was a physician and a philosopher. He started as a physician, and at the age of 37 he realized that he wanted to be a philosopher, so he studied philosophy and graduated, had a PhD in philosophy. And his grand idea that he developed in this book, that was basically his dissertation, and he had a kind of enormous influence, is that the definition that medicine gives of what is normal is not what is not health. A body that functions according that a physician says, oh, this body is normal, that doesn't mean that is not the equivalent of saying it is health. It is in health, because health and illness are characteristics of living beings. The connection is between health, is something typical of life. We can say that we can describe the biological characteristics of a chemical solution or of a rock, but we can say that a chemical solution is in good health or is sick, or a rock is in health or sick. We can say that a plant is in health or sick, or an animal or a man. So health, the concept of health and disease, of normal in meaning the equivalent of health, and pathological, are something that cannot be defined in mere biological terms. To him, health is more similar to the capacity to adaptation, is the capability that a living being have to get sick and recover, is the capacity of doing this back and forth. And the pathological condition is when this kind of reactivity, this capacity of adaptation, this capacity of recovery decrease and fail. This is to put really simple. the book, actually, the book was published for the first time in 1943, but then it was republished several times. This is the edition of 1978. The introduction was written by another French philosopher, Michel Foucault, and we will talk about him in the next sessions. Yes, so this was basically the Canguilhem main idea, without going through all the details of his development, which is kind of difficult to swallow because it's a kind of complicated philosophy. But yes, it's a way to apprehend. It's another way to show that to discuss about what is health and illness, what is normal and what is normal and what is pathological. It is we can't stop with the intellectual and practical tools of the medical science. We need to have a larger vision and to make other disciplines, other perspectives play and work together. So for students who are in my elective, we will meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. And for the rest of you, we meet on next Tuesday. Thank you so much. Thank you.